Continue with our Gemara on Sanhedrin, Kuf Yud Beis Amud Beis 112b. About a third from the bottom of the page. And the topic of discussion here is the commandment to destroy all property that belongs to the Ir Hanidachas, belongs to a city that's been diverted away from the service of Hashem and to idol worship. And we discussed that the verse explicitly states, in various different ways, that only items belonging to members of the city are destroyed, but rather to the exclusion of items belonging to heaven, belonging to the altar, belonging to the temple. And we discussed the various different levels of that. Whether it's animals dedicated to the temple, to the altar, money dedicated to upkeep of the temple, 10th animal, firstborn animal. Now we discuss Truma. So first the Gemara begins with the words of the Mishnah, Truma is Yirkavu. Any Truma is produce that by law one dedicates or donates, I should say, to the Kohen, to the priest. That stuff has to rot. One cannot eat it because it came from the castaway city. Even a Kohen can't eat it. On the other hand, you cannot burn it along with the rest of the property of the city because it's disrespectful to this food, which is a mitzvah was performed with it and has a certain degree of holiness, that it should be burnt, and thus it's left to rot. But we haven't qualified who owns this truma, who owns this produce that's been donated to the Kohen, where is it, and who owns it at the moment, making us not able to burn it and not able to eat it, but rather must be left to rot. Amar Rav Chisda says, like Shanu, this is only taught, this law with respect to produce truma that has to be left to rot. Like Shanu is only taught Ella Truma B'Yad Yisrael. If the truma is still in the hand of the Jew, the Israelite, who is donating it to the Kohen. Truma B'Yad Kohen, if it's truma in the hands of the Kohen, so say there's a priest who lives in a castaway city and he has the truma. Now what happens once that truma is donated to him? Once that truma is donated to him, it's his full property, and therefore kivun d'mamaynahu, because it's his property and he is a member of a castaway city, to start if it gets burnt. Okay, so if it belongs to the Jew, it's in the hands of the Jew, and the Jew decided he's going to donate it to the priest, but he hasn't yet donated it yet. And then it doesn't get burnt because it hasn't left the Jewish property yet. So what we're doing is we're assuming that the Jew lives outside of the Ir Hanidachas, outside of the castaway city, and he's dedicated it that it should be given to the Kohen. Then that stuff isn't burnt. Or even still, if he is even if this Jew lives in the castaway city and he's a wicked person, but because he's dedicated it to be given to the Kohen, it's no longer his property, and thus it's not burnt. And then it can be given to the Kohen for him to eat, seemingly. But if it's already in the hands of the Kohen, of the priest, and this priest is a member of the castaway city, then it's his private property because it's been donated to him, and then it has to be burnt with the rest of the property of that castaway city. Okay, Masa Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef raised the following challenge to the statement. We mentioned earlier, in an earlier text, previous class, I think it was two classes before this one, that secondary tithe and scrolls that have God's name on it, Yignizu, are to be buried. Now the secondary tithe is certain times, there's certain different types of tithes that have to be given. As we mentioned, there's Truma, there's the donation to the Kohen, there's donation to the Levite, and there's donation to the poor. And then there are certain years in which a certain percentage of the produce has to be taken to Jerusalem and eaten there, or redeemed, and then the money taken to Jerusalem, and you buy food there to eat in Jerusalem. That's called Ma'aser Sheni. So Ma'aser Sheni is also in this limbo state, in that it belongs to the Jew because the Jew gets to go eat it when he gets to Jerusalem. But still, it's a mitzvah performed with it. And therefore, because it still belongs to the Jew, it can't be, because it's holy, it cannot be burnt with the rest of the castaway city. On the other hand, it can't be eaten by this Jew. First of all, the Jew is being killed along with the rest of the members of the castaway city, and also it came from such a terrible place, it can't be eaten. And therefore, Yignazu, it's buried. And now the Gemara asks, now, V'maiser Sheni, secondary tithe, B'yad Yisrael, belongs to the Yisrael. Ketruma B'yad Kohen, just like the Kohen who owns Truma. We just said before that if a Kohen owns Truma, meaning a Jew already donated his produce to the Kohen as required, and this Kohen is a member of the castaway city, then this Truma has to be burnt because it belongs to him and it's his private property and he's a member of a castaway city. Now if that's the case, then Ma'aser Sheni, secondary tithe, which is also the private property of the individual Jew, so it should also get burnt. The Katana Yignazu, and yet we were taught that it should be buried rather than be burnt with the rest of the city. And if the protocol is that personal property, even if the personal property is of a mitzvah nature, like Truma in the hands of a Kohen is personal property that came to him at the hands through the guise of a mitzvah, and yet we said that it should be burnt. So why is it that when it comes to the secondary tithe, which is the private property of this individual Jew, because he gets to eat it when he brings it to Jerusalem, or he redeems it and then eats it in Jerusalem, it's his private property nonetheless, and yet we say because it's under the guise of a mitzvah, it can't be burnt with the rest of the castaway city, it has to be buried. And therefore says the Gemara, Eliyatmar, if you're going to quote the statement of Rav Chisda, which made this distinction between Truma in the hands of the Jew before it's given to the Kohen, and that's not his property, versus Truma, which is already in the hands of the Kohen, and therefore it is his property. If you're going to make that distinction, Hachi Itmar, here's how you have to teach it. So we're changing my words a little bit so that it fits with this particular law. Rav Chisda says, this is how you should be learning it. Ela Truma B'yad Kohen. This is only true if the Truma is already in the hand of the Kohen. Okay, so if Truma is in the hands of the Kohen, then it's his private property, and therefore it gets led to rot. It's his private property, and therefore it ought, in theory, be burnt, but because it came from the guise of the mitzvah, we can't do that, so we let it rot. But if this Truma is still in the hand of the Israelite, he's designated it to be given to the Kohen, but it hasn't been given yet, so it's not his property anymore, because he's designated to give away. But he's a member of a castaway city, so what do we do with this? It could be given to a priest in a different city, and that way it belongs to, and that way it's no longer the Jew who dedicated it. He's a member of the castaway city, so there's nothing he can do about it because he's a member of the castaway city, and therefore he has to give this tithe to a Kohen of a different city. He can't give it to a Kohen of this city because that city is a castaway city, and then it would make it be burnt. So he's got to give it to a Kohen that's from a different city, and then once it's the Kohen of a different city, it's his private property, and he could eat it in his other city. And it's no longer property of the castaway city. Okay, Tanan Hassam, and the Gemara is going to do a little comparative analysis to a different law, which also indicates to us who has the ownership of the secondary tithe. The secondary tithe being, again, this property that belongs to a certain tithe during certain years, which the Jew has to take to Jerusalem to eat there, so it's his private property, he gets to eat it, so it's not fully out of his control, but yet it's under the guise of a mitzvah because he has to take it to Jerusalem and eat it there. So it says like this, Tanan Hassam, we've learned. Isa, dough, Shalmaisha saying that was made of secondary tithe. P'tura Menachala is exempt from the law of Chala. What's the law of Chala? The law of Chala is, if a person's making dough, this is a mitzvah that still exists still today to a certain degree. A person's making a certain amount of dough, it has to be a certain size, but if you're making dough, then he takes a certain portion of that dough and he gives it to the Kohen. So now here's the interesting conundrum. This is dough made of Ma'aser Sheni of secondary tithe. So this produce from which he's making the dough is already in the guise of mitzvah because it's supposed to be taken to Jerusalem to eat there. It's a secondary tithe. And now that he's making the dough, there's a new obligation to take challah. So David Meir says that he does not have to eat. He doesn't have to take challah from the dough made of secondary tithe. Why? Because it's already part of a mitzvah. So it's already not his. Taking the challah, taking this bit of dough to give to the Kohen is only when you're making your own dough. But because over here you're doing it for the mitzvah of the secondary tithe, it's not your private property, and therefore you're not required, you're exempt from giving challah to the Kohen. But Chachamim, the sages say, you are obligated. Why are you obligated? Because you get to eat it. So if you get to eat it, it's your property. Even though it's secondary tithe, and you have to eat it in Jerusalem, and you have to eat it as part of a mitzvah, it's still yours. And considering that it's yours, therefore you do take the challah. Now, Rav Chisda said, the same Rav Chisda who spoke earlier, with respect to making the distinction between whether the truma is in the hands of the Kohen and therefore has to rot because he's a member of a castaway city, or as opposed to if it belongs to if the truma is still in the hands of the Jew, he hasn't given it to the kohen yet. He's designated to the kohen yet, and Rav Chisda said he has to give it to a kohen that's in a different city, because a kohen in that city can't take it because he's from a castaway city. So this same Rav Chisda says now, with respect to secondary tithe, and this dispute as to whether or not between Rabbi Meir and the sages, as to whether or not you have to take challah from dough made from secondary tithe. Rav Chisda says, machlekes, the dispute is ma'aser sheni b'Yerushalayim. If it's secondary tithe already in Yerushalayim, so you're already in Jerusalem. The Rabbi Meir says, ma'aser sheni mammon gavayahu. You're in Jerusalem. Now, even though you're supposed to eat it, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to Hashem. It belongs to the mitzvah. But the mitzvah is you eat it in Jerusalem. But Rabbanan Savid above and say, no, once you've arrived in Jerusalem, mammon hedged you, it becomes your private property. So until you leave, bring it to Jerusalem, it belongs to the mitzvah. But the mitzvah is to bring it to Jerusalem and eat it there. So once you've walked into Jerusalem with that food, say the sages, it belongs to you personally and you can eat it. And therefore, because you're in Jerusalem, Rabbi Meir says it belongs to heaven and you're obligated to eat it. And because it belongs to heaven, therefore you don't take challah because it doesn't belong to you. Whereas the sages say, because you've entered Jerusalem and you fulfilled your mitzvah bringing it to Jerusalem, so now it belongs to you personally. And because it belongs to you personally, if you made dough out of it, you have to take challah. This is the way Rav Chisda explains the dispute. Which would mean, but if you're not in Jerusalem itself, you're in the rest of the territories of Israel, everybody would say, Pater, you're exempt from taking challah. Why? Because it doesn't belong to you. Because you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah yet. The moment it becomes produce, you're responsible to bring it to Jerusalem. And therefore, the fact that you turned it into dough, you turned mitzvah food into dough. It's not your personal property. And therefore, everybody agrees that when it's in the rest of the territories of Israel, you're not in Jerusalem, and you're taking the secondary tithe, which you're supposed to bring to Jerusalem later, and you're making it into dough, you don't take challah. Why? Because it's not yours. It belongs to the mitzvah. Now, if that's the case, Rabbi asked the following question. We've learned secondary tithe that belongs to a castaway city. Likewise, kisvei kodesh, scrolls that have God's name, have to be buried. Now, Rabbi Chisda just said that ma'aser sheni, secondary tithe, before you brought it to Jerusalem, belongs to the mitzvah, doesn't belong to the individual, and that's why he's obligated to take the challah, because it doesn't. That's why he's exempt. From taking challah, because it's not his personal property; it belongs to the mitzvah. Now, if that's the case, secondary tithe that came from a castaway city also doesn't belong to the individual; it belongs to heaven. And if it belongs to heaven, why should it be buried? Let it be taken to Jerusalem. And the Gemara elaborates on this question. The Maya Skina, what are we referring to? If you want to say the castaway city is Jerusalem, and therefore the sages, Rav Chisda explained, said earlier that once the secondary tithe is brought to Jerusalem, and you've fulfilled the mitzvah, the property is now yours, the produce now belongs to you. Then maybe the castaway city is talking about where Jerusalem itself became a castaway city. And if Jerusalem itself became a castaway city, then the secondary tithe there belongs to you as an individual, because the mitzvah is already done, you're already in Jerusalem. But that can't be the case, because Ir Hanidachas, could Jerusalem become a castaway city? Or Tanya, what we've been taught, there are 10 things you said with respect to Jerusalem, and one of the 10 of them is this idea, that doesn't become a castaway city, which means rather, therefore, must be some other city in Israel became a castaway city. And this individual who came from the castaway city somewhere outside of Jerusalem took a secondary tithe to Jerusalem. Right? And that's why it's his private property, and that's why it has to be buried and not burnt with the rest of the castaway city, because it's his. Right, that's why he cannot eat it. It has to be buried because it belongs to him, and he's a member of a castaway city, and that's why it has to be buried. But the walls of Jerusalem cut it off, meaning to say, the moment you enter Jerusalem, it becomes fully, completely your private property. So why should it be buried at all? In other words, the fact that it's buried is kind of a limbo. It means that it belongs to the individual, and that's why it ought to be burnt. But out of respect for it, we're not burning it, and therefore burying it. But seemingly, once you bring the tithe to Jerusalem, the walls of the city cut it off, making it have no relationship to its outside to the outside place where it came from the other city, and in this case being the castaway city. And if that's the case, it should be eaten. Why should it be buried? It's been cut off from its relationship to the old city. So, if ma'aser sheni, if secondary tithe, the moment you enter Jerusalem, becomes your private property completely, why should secondary tithe from a castaway city be buried? Seemingly, it's no longer the property of the castaway cities, given the fact that Jerusalem cuts it off. Once it enters Jerusalem, it's cut off with no relationship to its old location. Elalav, therefore what must we say? Begvulin. Rather, we must say there's a castaway city in the rest of the it must come from the castaway city in the rest of the territories of Israel. The Katani Yignizu, and yet we say it has to be buried, and it cannot be eaten by the individual who brought it there. Meaning, which would imply that it still has a relationship with the castaway city, which is why it has to be buried rather than eaten. So the Gemara, no, we must say the Ir Hanidachas. The Ir Hanidachas. It's coming from a different city outside of, not Jerusalem, obviously, because Jerusalem can't become a castaway city. It's coming from a different city, which became a castaway city. Vasikul Gavoya, and he brought it to Jerusalem. Now, we just finished saying that once it's brought to Jerusalem, it no longer has any connection to its old city. So why can't it be eaten? Why does it have to be buried? On here, what we're talking about, it became impure. And because it came impure, it can no longer be eaten. It contracted ritual impurity. And because it can no longer be eaten, we kind of say, look, it's not your private property anymore. It's only your private property if you can fully eat it in Jerusalem. But because it became impure, you can't eat it. It's not your property to be eaten because it's become impure, and therefore it kind of still has its connection to its old city because it's not your property anymore, and therefore it's buried. I'm sorry. Because it can't be eaten, therefore it belongs to you. If it were eaten, it means it's a mitzvah to eat it, and if it means it doesn't have a connection to the old city. But because it's been made impure, and therefore you can eat it, therefore it's still yours because you can't fulfill the mitzvah with it, and because you can't fulfill the mitzvah with it, and it's yours because it's impure, therefore it's still connected to the old castaway city, and that's why it's buried. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, fulfil, so then redeem it. Because the law is, as Rabbi said, any secondary tithe that became impure, so you can redeem it, as we explained in the previous classes what redeem means. Even if it came to Jerusalem. So how do you know that's the case? Talmud Loimar, because the verse reads, the verse says that if you can't carry the food to Jerusalem, the secondary tithe, or because Jerusalem is too far for you, so it seems to be a double expression. You can't carry it to Jerusalem and it's too far for you. So explains, what it means you can't carry it to Jerusalem doesn't mean you can't carry it, but it means you can't eat it. Why can't you eat it? Because it's impure. How do we know that carrying means eating? As the verse reads, it says with respect to the 12 tribes, the 11 tribes that they left Joseph, that they carried their baggages leaving Joseph, and when they carried their baggages, the baggage there is a reference to food. So we see that carrying can mean food. All to say that when the verse says that if you're too far from Jerusalem or you can't carry it to Jerusalem, it means you can't eat in Jerusalem. Why can't you eat it in Jerusalem? Because it's been made impure. What do you do with it? Says Rabbi, you can redeem it. So now, if that's the case, then a person who came from a castaway city outside of Jerusalem, and he brings a secondary tithe to Jerusalem, and now when he's in Jerusalem, the city he came from has been deemed a castaway city. Now, and this tithe became impure. So because it's impure, you're telling me, and because it's impure and you can't eat it, and because you can't eat it and you can't fulfill the mitzvah, it still has its connection to its old city and therefore should be buried. Why should you bury it? Says the Gemara. Why don't you just redeem it, pay out the value of it, take that money and then eat it, take the value of the money, buy food and eat the food, which means you still own it because you can redeem it. And then you can eat it and enjoy it. I'm sorry, so that means it still belongs to the mitzvah. Just because it's impure doesn't mean the mitzvah is no longer available to you. You were saying that the reason why it's still attached to its old city is because you can no longer do the mitzvah because it's become impure. But when it becomes impure, I can redeem it. That means I can still fulfill the mitzvah even if it became impure. And if I can still fulfill the mitzvah of secondary tithe by eating in Jerusalem through redemption, then that means it belongs to Jerusalem. It doesn't belong to the castaway city. So why should it be buried? Let it be eaten in Jerusalem through redemption. Says the Gemara, no, and here what are we talking about? We're talking about b'lakoyach. You already redeemed the property and you bought other food. And at this point the Gemara is assuming that once you redeemed it and bought other food, and then that other food became impure, you can no longer redeem it. And if you can no longer redeem it, that means you can't fulfill the mitzvah. And if you can't fulfill the mitzvah, it doesn't belong to the mitzvah, it belongs to the old city, and therefore it's redeemed. And therefore it's buried. Top of page, Kufyud Gimel Madalef 113a. The Gemara asks, but v'lifrike, redeem that too? Who said once you've redeemed it once and it became impure once you've redeemed it once, you bought more food and it became impure, who said you can't redeem it again? Redeem it again? The Tanan, because we've been taught, halakoyach b'kesef meiser, something which is bought with the money that was used to redeem. the secondary tithe, that food became impure, you can redeem it. Which means, according to this view at least, it doesn't matter how many times it comes impure, you can redeem it. So if you can redeem it, that means it still has a connection to the mitzvah. And if it still has a connection to the mitzvah, it's no longer connected to the castaway city, and therefore it doesn't have to be buried, you can eat it. Says the Gemara, no, Rabbi Yehuda, this falls to the view of Rabbi Yehuda. The Amar Yikaver, Rabbi Yehuda is the one person who says that once secondary tithe has been redeemed once, and it became impure, it can no longer be redeemed, it has to be buried. And therefore, because it has to be buried, it's no longer property of the mitzvah because you can't eat it, and therefore it still has an old connection to the castaway city. But says the Gemara, you just said it, Rabbi Yehuda says you have to bury it. Then what's unique about the law of the Ir Hanidachas? Any time secondary tithe, which became impure, and then you redeemed it, and then you use that money to buy other food, and that food became impure, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you always bury it because it's no longer edible as a mitzvah. If that's the case, what's the uniqueness of the law of the Ir Hanidachas? The secondary tithe that came from an Ir Hanidachas, from a castaway city, has to be buried. Anytime secondary tithe was redeemed and then impure, it has to be buried. So therefore we have to scrap this whole thing and reevaluate this whole thing. So the Gemara, no. We're talking about regular secondary tithe, which never became impure, and the person is from a castaway city. He brought his secondary tithe to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, the city he came from has been deemed as a castaway city. Now, if it's been deemed a castaway city, seemingly the food he brought to Jerusalem is already part of the mitzvah. Why is it being buried? Answer could go into nothing lechitzis, because the walls of Jerusalem are no longer standing. Well, why does it change if the walls of Jerusalem are no longer standing? And this follows the opinion of Rabbi. Rabbi said, mechitza lechol daraisa. Biblically speaking, the moment you bring the secondary tithe into the walls of Jerusalem, the physical walls of Jerusalem, biblically speaking, you have to eat it there. Likloit rabbanon. Our sages say that once it enters the walls of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem holds onto it and separates it from being connected to its old location. But when do our sages say that food entered in Jerusalem and now no longer has connection to the old city, to the old place where it came from, which would mean that once it entered Jerusalem, it belongs to the mitzvah. It doesn't belong to the original old location of the castaway city, and therefore it does not have to be buried. That's only true when the walls are physically there. If the walls, God forbid, fell, there's no more walls, then even though you're in Jerusalem and you fulfilled your obligation of bringing the secondary tithe there, but it doesn't have the effect of disconnecting it from its old castaway city, and therefore it's not connected to its old city. It doesn't disconnect it from its old city, and because it's not disconnected from its old city, even though it's pure food and theoretically you could eat it, nevertheless it has to be buried because it hasn't been fully detached from its old city, the Ir Hanidachas. Okay, so all to say, in summary, truma, the produce that has to be donated to a kohen, to a priest, if it hasn't been donated yet, it's still on the property of a Jew. And if it's in the property of a Jew, and he designated that it's going to be given to the kohen, he's got to give it to a kohen in a different city. It can't be given to a kohen here in the castaway city, obviously. And even though he's a member of the castaway city, because it's already been dedicated for the mitzvah and no longer belongs to him, it doesn't have to be burnt. It has to be given to a kohen in a different city. If, however, the kohen himself is a member of the castaway city, and truma was given to him because it belongs to him personally, and it's a part of the castaway city. He's a part of the castaway city, therefore that produce is left to rot. It can't be burnt along with the rest of the city because it's not respectful, but you can't eat it because it belongs to the castaway city, and therefore it's left to rot. Secondary tithe. When you're outside of Jerusalem, then the moment the produce is available, you are responsible to take it to Jerusalem. So it belongs to the mitzvah, it doesn't belong to you. And therefore no challah. You don't take challah from that because the dough doesn't belong to you, it belongs to heaven. Once you bring it to Jerusalem, and you fulfill the mitzvah, so at this point it belongs to you. Now if it belongs to you, then at this point you no longer have to take the challah. I'm sorry, you have to take the challah because now it belongs to you. However, once you bring it to Jerusalem, if it's inside the walls of Jerusalem disconnected from its old location, and therefore even if it came from a castaway city, you can still eat that food in Jerusalem. But when the walls are down, then the wall is no longer separated from its castaway city, and therefore when you bring it to Jerusalem, even though you fulfilled the mitzvah, now it belongs to you, nonetheless, it has to be let to rot because the walls are no longer there to separate it from its attachments to the old castaway city, and therefore it has to be left to rot. All right, stop over here, and God willing, we'll continue tomorrow.